To get revenge on his ex-fiancée, an arrogant CEO offered a baker $100,000 to ruin the wedding. What he didn't expect was that her plan for revenge was much bigger than his. Good morning, whether you're on your morning commute or enjoying your coffee. It would be wonderful to know where you're listening from today. Please leave a greeting from your city in the comments, and have a wonderful day. The city sprawled below the penthouse like a carpet of scattered diamonds, silent and distant. From 50 floors up, the chaos of the streets was reduced to a muted, elegant light show, a kingdom viewed from the throne of a detached god. Inside, the air was still and cool, scented with the faint, clean aroma of Italian leather, and something else, the sterile fragrance of success. This was Calvin Moore's world, a space of polished concrete floors, sharp-angled furniture, and vast panes of glass that kept the city at a beautiful, manageable distance. Calvin stood before the window, his back to the room. The silhouette of his custom-tailored suit was sharp, uncompromising. He held a phone to his ear, the device looking like a fragile toy in his hand. "No," he said, his voice a low, even baritone that carried the weight of finality. "The deal is not being renegotiated. My offer was final an hour ago. Your client's window of opportunity has closed." A tinny, frantic voice buzzed from the other end, but Calvin was no longer listening. He was watching a helicopter slice silently through the night sky, its blinking red light a lonely star. Power, he mused, wasn't about winning the argument. It was about having the ability to end the conversation. He pressed the button to end the call, the silence that followed feeling deeper, more profound than before. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the $1,000 phone onto the vast white leather sofa. It landed without a sound, swallowed by the opulence. He moved to the wet bar, a single slab of black marble that jutted from the wall. His movements were economical, precise. He selected a heavy crystal tumbler, the facets catching the dim light, and poured 3 fingers of scotch. The amber liquid swirled, the scent of peat and smoke rising to meet him. He took a slow sip, letting the burn travel down his throat. It was a familiar fire, a welcome distraction from the hollowness that gnawed at the edges of his victory. He had just closed a deal worth 9 figures, crushed a competitor, and reshaped a small corner of the market in his own image. He should have felt a rush, a surge of triumph. Instead, he felt nothing, an echo in an empty hall. His gaze drifted across the room and settled on a piece of heavy, cream-colored cardstock propped against a minimalist lamp on the coffee table. It was the only object in the room that felt out of place, a frivolous intrusion into his curated world of steel and glass. He walked over, picking it up. The edges were gilded, the lettering an ornate, looping script that screamed of old money and tradition. "Ava Wilson and Jonathan Hayes request the honor of your presence at their marriage." Calvin's jaw tightened. Ava. The name was a bitter taste on his tongue. He ran a thumb over her name, the embossed letters a faint braille of betrayal. He remembered her laughter, the way she'd looked at him as if he were the center of the universe, right before she had calmly explained that his vision for the future was, in her words, too consuming. She had chosen Jonathan Hayes, a man whose greatest ambition was to inherit his father's law firm and live a life of comfortable, predictable mediocrity. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the crystal tumbler. The ice inside cracked with a sharp report, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. A shard of glass, fine as a needle, could have pierced his skin, but he wouldn't have noticed. The wound was deeper, invisible. It was a wound to his ego, a public declaration that he, Calvin Moore, was not enough, that he could be left behind. She thinks she can just drop me and have it all? The thought was a venomous whisper in the quiet of his mind. She thinks she can walk away unscathed and build her perfect little life on the rubble of my pride? He stared down at the invitation, at the 2 names joined by a delicate ampersand. A cold, clear purpose began to crystallize within him, displacing the empty ache. "I'll show her," he thought, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time that evening. "Calvin Moore is never the one left behind. I'll go to her wedding, but I won't be a guest. I'll be the main event." I'll turn her perfect day into my own stage. Miles away, in a world without polished concrete or skyline views, the key turned in a stubborn lock. The door to Sophia Baker's apartment swung open with a familiar squeak, releasing a wave of warm air that smelled faintly of cinnamon and yeast. It was a stark contrast to the sterile quiet of Calvin's penthouse. This was a space that was lived in, a home carved out of necessity and care. The furniture was second-hand but well-loved. A colorful quilt was draped over the back of the sofa, and a row of thriving succulents lined the windowsill. Sophia stepped inside, weariness clinging to her like a second skin. She dropped her keys into a ceramic bowl by the door and leaned back against the wood, closing her eyes for a moment. The sweet, cloying scent of buttercream and sugar seemed to have seeped into her very pores, a permanent reminder of her 10-hour shift at the corner slice bakery. She could still feel the phantom ache in her wrists from kneading dough, the heat of the ovens on her face. Her eyes opened and immediately fell on the small stack of envelopes on the mail table, bills. The crisp white corners and official-looking logos were a familiar source of pressure. She picked them up, her thumb brushing over the red ink of a past-due notice. A long, slow sigh escaped her lips, but as she exhaled, her shoulders squared. It was the sigh of a fighter, not a victim. The weariness in her eyes was eclipsed by a flicker of unwavering resolve. She walked into her small living area, tossing the bills onto the coffee table. She wouldn't look at them now. Now was not the time for surrender. Instead, she knelt and pulled a worn wooden box from beneath the table. It was simple, unadorned, but she handled it with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a photograph of a man with kind eyes and a smile that seemed to light up the world. Edward Baker, her father. He was younger in the picture, vibrant, with the easy confidence of a man who believed in the good of the world. Sophia traced the outline of his face with her fingertip, a sad smile touching her own lips. Beside the photo lay a small stack of yellowed newspaper clippings. She picked one up. The headline was stark, brutal. Baker Industries collapses amid fraud scandal. And there, in a grainy photograph of a press conference, was a face she saw in her nightmares. A young Ava Wilson, standing just behind her own father, her expression a perfect mask of concerned innocence. An intern who had been in the right place at the right time to witness a titan's fall, or to give the final push. Sophia's grip on the clipping tightened, her knuckles turning white. The warmth of her father's memory was instantly chased away by a familiar, cold fury. This box held both her reason for living and the source of her pain. It was her past and her future. "Dad," she thought, her voice a silent, fervent promise in the quiet of her small apartment, "I won't let you down. I will take back everything that belongs to us, every last shred of our name, our legacy." Her gaze fixed on Ava Wilson's face, a face now plastered on society pages, a face preparing for a fairy tale wedding. "Ava Wilson," Sophia vowed, her eyes hard as flint. "Your judgment day is coming." The rain began in the late afternoon, a soft, gray drizzle that quickly thickened into a downpour, lashing against the windows of the corner slice. Inside, the bakery was a warm, fragrant haven. The air was thick with the comforting sense of baking bread, melting chocolate, and brewing coffee. Sophia was behind the counter, wiping down the glass display case, her movements efficient and practiced. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful, incongruous sound against the drumming of the rain. Sophia looked up, a polite customer service smile ready on her lips. The smile faltered. A man stood just inside the doorway, shaking water from a black umbrella that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He wore a charcoal gray suit of a material so fine it seemed to repel the rain. It was perfectly tailored to a frame that was tall, lean, and radiated an almost aggressive confidence. He was, in a word, magnificent. And he was as out of place in her small, cozy bakery as a wolf in a sheep pen. His eyes, a cool, piercing shade of blue, scanned the room before landing on her. He had done his research. He'd had his people find someone unassuming, someone who looked like she could be easily managed, but had a spark of defiance in her posture. Sophia Baker, the baker with the proud chin and the tired eyes, was perfect. He strode directly to the counter, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the worn linoleum floor. He didn't glance at the pastries. He looked directly at her, as if she were a line item on a balance sheet he was about to acquire. "Sophia Baker?" he asked. It wasn't really a question. "Can I help you?" she replied, her tone carefully neutral. He placed a sleek black business card on the counter. "My name is Calvin Moore. I have a proposition for you." Sophia glanced at the card. The name meant nothing to her, but the embossed lettering felt expensive. "I'm not looking for a new flower supplier," she said, her voice dry. A corner of his mouth twitched, a fleeting sign of amusement. "I'm not selling anything. I'm buying your time." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, businesslike tone. "I will pay you $100,000 to act as my girlfriend for one weekend. The occasion is a wedding." Sophia stared at him. The number hung in the air between them, shimmering and absurd. $100,000. It was a life-changing sum. It was the answer to the stack of bills on her table, the key to a life without the constant grinding pressure of debt. For a dizzying second, she imagined it. Then reality crashed back in. She saw the cool calculation in his eyes, the casual way he offered the sum, as if it were pocket change. He wasn't offering a lifeline, he was purchasing a prop. Her spine stiffened. She pushed his card back across the counter. "No, thank you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "My self-respect isn't for sale." Calvin's expression hardened. He was not accustomed to the word no. He saw it as a negotiating tactic, not a final answer. "I can make it $150," he said, his tone clipped. "The price isn't the issue," Sophia said, turning away to rearrange a tray of croissants that was already perfectly arranged. "I'm not interested." Frustration flared in Calvin's eyes. He had no time for this. He was about to turn, to storm out and have his assistant find someone more pliable, when Sophia spoke again, her back still to him. "Whose wedding is it?" she asked, her voice light, almost conversational, as if the thought had just occurred to her. Calvin paused, his hand on the door. The question was unexpected. "Why?" She finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Just curious what kind of event commands that kind of price for a date." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "The kind of event you'll be reading about in the society pages," he said with a dismissive wave. "It's for Ava Wilson." The name struck Sophia like a physical blow. For a fraction of a second, the world tilted, the scent of sugar and butter replaced by the phantom smell of old newspapers and betrayal. Her carefully constructed composure almost cracked, but she held it. She held it, and through the fissure, a brilliant, blinding light of opportunity shone through. This is it. The thought screamed through her mind, a clarion call. The door, the one I've been waiting for my entire life. It just opened. She looked at Calvin Moore, truly looked at him for the first time. He wasn't a client. He wasn't an arrogant billionaire. He was a key. He was the weapon she never knew she needed. Her expression shifted, the disinterest melting away, replaced by a calm, unnerving focus. "I've changed my mind," she said, her voice steady and clear. The power dynamic in the small bakery had just irrevocably shifted. "I'll do it, but on my terms." The boutique was less a store and more a temple, dedicated to the worship of fashion. It was a cavernous space of white marble, brushed gold fixtures, and intimidatingly sparse racks, where individual dresses were displayed like works of art. The air smelled of expensive perfume and money. For Calvin, it was familiar territory. For Sophia, it felt like a foreign planet. Calvin was in his element, moving through the space with the predatory grace of a shark in its home waters. This was part of the plan, another transaction. Step 1, acquire the asset. Step 2, package it for presentation. He gestured to a sales associate, a woman with a severe haircut and an even more severe smile. We need a complete wardrobe for the weekend. Evening gowns, cocktail dresses, resort wear, the best of everything, he commanded, his voice echoing slightly in the hushed space. He began pulling dresses from the racks himself, his choices quick and decisive. A shimmering gold sequin gown, low-cut and dramatic. A fiery red dress, tight and unapologetically loud. A vibrant fuchsia number with a dangerously high slit. Each one was a statement piece, designed to scream for attention. Each one was something Ava would have worn. He was trying to build a weapon, and he was using his ex-girlfriend's blueprints to do it. Sophia watched him, her arms crossed. She stood silently as the associate laid the dresses out in a private viewing suite, a sea of garish color and glittering fabric. They were beautiful, she supposed, in the way a fireworks display was beautiful, dazzling, explosive, and utterly impersonal. They were costumes, designed to transform the wearer into a spectacle. They had nothing to do with her. "Well?" Calvin said, turning to her with an expectant air. "Pick one for tonight's welcome dinner." Sophia looked from the dresses to his face. She saw his strategy clearly. He wasn't just dressing her. He was trying to erase her, to pour a new, more glamorous personality into the empty vessel he thought he had hired. "No," she said simply. Calvin's eyebrow arched. "No, these are the finest designs of the season." "They're not me," she replied, her voice even. "This isn't about you," he retorted, a sharp edge of impatience in his tone. "This is about making an impact. This is about showing Ava what she's missing." Sophia met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw the steel beneath her quiet exterior. "And you think showing up with a cheap copy of her is the way to do that?" she asked, her question slicing through his arrogance. "A clone in a different dress? That's not a threat, Mr. Moore. That's a compliment. It tells her she's still living in your head." Calvin was momentarily speechless. He had expected arguments about price, about comfort, but not this, not a calm, logical deconstruction of his entire strategy. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not defiance, but a keen, analytical intelligence. It was irritating, and to a part of him he refused to acknowledge, it was intriguing. Ignoring him, Sophia turned to the bewildered sales associate. "Do you have anything quieter?" she asked. "Perhaps in a deep green or navy, silk or velvet. Simple silhouette, excellent cut." She walked past the racks Calvin had selected from, running her hand lightly over the fabrics until she stopped. She pulled out a single dress. It was the color of a forest at midnight, a deep emerald green. It was cut from a heavy liquid silk that draped rather than clung. It had long sleeves, a modest neckline, and a deceptively simple design. It was the kind of dress that didn't shout, it whispered. It made you lean in closer to hear what it had to say. When she emerged from the dressing room a few minutes later, Calvin fell silent. The dress was perfect. It didn't transform her into someone else. Instead, it amplified who she already was. It highlighted the strength in her posture, the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet confidence that he was beginning to realize was not a product of wealth or status, but was innate to her. She looked elegant, powerful, and completely, utterly herself. She was more of a threat to Ava in this simple dress than she would have been in 1,000 sequins. She's different, the thought came to him unbidden. She's not overwhelmed by the money, by the clothes. That look in her eyes, it's not defiance, it's assessment. She's challenging me. A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine one this time. Interesting. The resort was an oasis of manicured luxury, a sprawling estate of terracotta roofs, lush gardens, and infinity pools that bled into the horizon. The pre-wedding dinner was being held on a wide stone terrace overlooking the ocean, lit by the soft glow of fairy lights woven through ancient olive trees. The air was filled with the murmur of polite conversation, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the distant sound of waves crashing on a private beach. When Sophia walked onto the terrace at Calvin's side, a subtle but immediate shift occurred. Heads turned. Conversations paused for a beat too long. She was an unknown variable in a world of predictable equations. In her emerald green dress, with her hair styled in a simple, elegant knot at the nape of her neck, she didn't blend in. She stood out, not because she was loud, but because she was serene. She moved with a quiet self-possession that was more captivating than any sequin. Calvin felt a surge of possessive pride. This was better than his original plan. Showing up with a carbon copy of Ava would have been a childish taunt. This woman at his side was a statement of evolution. He was no longer the man Ava had left. He had moved on to something more refined, more intriguing. He offered Sophia a glass of champagne, his fingers brushing hers. "Ready for the lion's den?" he murmured, his voice low. "I've handled worse than a few lions," she replied, her voice equally quiet, a small, confident smile playing on her lips. And then, as if summoned, the lioness appeared. Ava Wilson glided towards them, a vision in white lace and diamonds. She was flawlessly beautiful, her smile a dazzling, perfectly rehearsed weapon. Her eyes, however, bypassed Calvin and landed directly on Sophia, conducting a swift, brutal assessment from head to toe. "Calvin, darling," she cooed, placing a proprietary hand on his arm. "I'm so glad you could make it. And you've brought a friend." Her gaze flickered back to Sophia. "I'm Ava." "Sophia," she replied, her voice calm and steady, not offering a last name. Ava's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Sophia, what a lovely name." "You must tell me, where did Calvin find you? I'm always so fascinated by the stories of how people meet." The question was coated in sugar, but the subtext was pure acid. What rock did he crawl under to find you? Before Calvin could intervene, Sophia answered, her own smile polite but unwavering. "Oh, you know," she said with a light, airy tone. "The usual places. We have some old family connections in common. It's such a small world, isn't it?" The response was brilliant in its ambiguity. It hinted at a shared history, at a pedigree that Ava couldn't immediately dismiss or place. Ava's perfect smile faltered for a split second. She had expected a flustered, intimidated response. Instead, she got a chess move. Recovering quickly, Ava laughed, a sound like tiny, tinkling bells. "Well, I'm sure we'll hear all about it." She turned her attention fully to Sophia, her voice dripping with false concern. "You must be exhausted. It's a lot to take in, I'm sure. This world can be overwhelming for newcomers." The condescension was palpable. Ava was reasserting her dominance, positioning Sophia as a tourist in her world. Just then a waiter passed by with a tray of red wine. Ava, without breaking eye contact with Sophia, made a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture with her hand. The waiter stumbled, as if catching his foot on an invisible crack in the stone. The tray tilted. A full glass of deep, red wine arced through the air, splashing directly down the front of Sophia's emerald green dress. Gasps rippled through the nearby guests. Ava's hand flew to her mouth in a perfect pantomime of shock. "Oh my goodness! I am so sorry," she exclaimed, her eyes gleaming with triumph. The waiter stammered apologies, dabbing uselessly at the dark spreading stain with a napkin. The simple, elegant dress was ruined. Sophia was now the center of attention, for all the wrong reasons. A clumsy, stained outsider. Sophia looked down at the dark red bloom on her dress, then slowly lifted her eyes to meet Ava's. There was no panic in her gaze, no tears, only a cold, clear understanding. Still the same dirty tricks, she thought. The fury in her heart, a quiet, controlled burn. But I'm not the little girl I used to be, Ava. With a calm nod to the flustered waiter and a polite, tight smile that offered Ava no satisfaction, Sophia excused herself. "If you'll excuse me," she said, her voice betraying nothing, I need to find the powder room. She turned and walked away, her back straight, her head held high, leaving a wake of whispers behind her. Calvin watched her go, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He knew Ava. He knew that move was as accidental as a sniper's bullet. It was petty, cruel, and designed for maximum public humiliation. And it infuriated him. Not just because it was an attack on his guest, his employee, he corrected himself, but because of its sheer predictable vulgarity. He shot Ava a look of pure ice, a look that made her triumphant smile wither. Without a word, he turned and followed the path Sophia had taken. He found her not in the ladies' room, but up a short flight of stone steps on a small, deserted rooftop terrace. The noise of the party below was a distant hum, replaced by the rhythmic shushing of the waves and the cool, salty breeze off the ocean. She was standing at the stone balustrade, looking out at the dark, endless expanse of water. He had expected to find her crying, or furiously dabbing at the stain, or perhaps on the phone, venting to a friend. He was prepared to offer a curt, businesslike apology, and perhaps a bonus for the inconvenience. But she was doing none of those things. She was perfectly still, her hands resting on the cool stone. The dark stain on her dress was stark in the moonlight, but she seemed to have forgotten it was even there. He walked toward her, shrugging off his suit jacket as he went. "Here," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. He held it out to her. She turned, her expression surprised to see him. She looked at the jacket, then back at his face, but made no move to take it. "Thank you, but I'm not cold," she said. "It's to cover the stain," he said, stating the obvious. He expected her to complain, to lament the ruined dress, to blame Ava. It's what any other woman would do. Instead, a small, wry smile touched her lips. She turned back to the ocean. "She's afraid," she said, her voice quiet, almost thoughtful. "That's why she did it." Calvin stopped, the jacket still in his hands. The observation was so far from what he'd anticipated that it took him a moment to process. "Afraid?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Ava isn't afraid of anything." Sophia finally turned to face him fully, leaning back against the balustrade. For the first time, they weren't employer and employee, or two strangers in a transaction. They were just two people on a moonlit terrace. "Of course she is," Sophia said, her voice losing its guarded edge and taking on a surprising clarity. "She's afraid of you. Not because she wants you back, but because your presence here with me proves that she's replaceable. Her entire identity is built on being the irreplaceable center of attention. A new woman at your side, especially one she can't immediately categorize and dismiss, is a threat to that identity. The wine wasn't about me, it was about her, marking her territory." He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the sharp intelligence he'd glimpsed in the boutique. But now he also saw a profound perceptiveness, a deep understanding of human nature that he had not expected. And beneath that, he saw something else. A deep, ancient sadness in her eyes, a weariness that had nothing to do with a long shift at a bakery. It was the look of a soldier, not a victim. A sudden gust of wind swept across the terrace, whipping a loose strand of hair across her face. At the same moment, a single drop of moisture traced a path down her cheek. Was it a tear she refused to shed? Or just sea spray carried on the wind? He didn't know. And for some reason, he didn't care. Without thinking, without conscious thought or strategic intent, he reached out. His fingers, surprisingly gentle, brushed the strand of hair from her cheek, and then, with the pad of his thumb, wiped away the single glistening drop. The moment hung in the air, charged and silent. His touch was light, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through both of them. It was a gesture of simple, uncalculated human connection. In that instant, the contract, the money, and the intricate games they were playing all fell away, leaving only the startling awareness of the man and woman standing in the moonlight. A genuine spark had just been lit. The wedding ceremony was a masterpiece of calculated perfection. Held in a garden overlooking the sea, thousands of white roses had been woven into arches and draped over every available surface, their scent heavy in the warm air. A string quartet played softly, their music a tasteful backdrop to the quiet murmurs of the obscenely wealthy guests. Ava was radiant, a triumphant queen in a cloud of designer lace, her smile never wavering as she said her vows. Calvin and Sophia sat in the third row. To the outside world, they were the perfect picture of a handsome, powerful couple. He, in a flawlessly cut tuxedo, was a study in controlled intensity. She, in an elegant navy blue dress, a replacement chosen with the same quiet confidence as the first, was the picture of grace. But beneath the surface, the air between them crackled with the unresolved energy from the night before. The ceremony concluded, and the guests moved to an extravagant marquee for the reception. Champagne flowed, and a tower of glistening macarons stood in place of a traditional cake. After the first dance and the cutting of the cake, the time came for the speeches. The best man told a series of bland, predictable jokes. The maid of honor cried. And then Ava, glowing under the soft lights, took the microphone. "I just want to thank you all for being here," she began, her voice sweet as honey. "And I want to give a special thank you to my dear, dear friend, Calvin Moore, for coming today. It means the world to me that we can still be so close." A ripple of polite applause went through the crowd. Calvin felt Sophia tense beside him. Ava's eyes, sparkling with malice, found them in the crowd. "And Calvin, you old romantic, you even brought a date. It's so wonderful to see you moving on." She paused, letting the attention settle fully on them. "In fact, I heard the most charming story. Calvin was so determined to have a companion for the weekend, he actually went to this lovely little bakery, the Corner Slice, and, well, he recruited one of the charming girls who works there to fill the position. Isn't that just the sweetest, most resourceful thing you've ever heard?" The air in the marquee went still. The polite smiles froze on the guests' faces. It was a masterfully cruel move, delivered with a radiant smile. In one swift stroke, Ava had exposed their arrangement, framed Calvin as pathetic and desperate, and branded Sophia as a hired nobody, a piece of temporary help. To complete the humiliation, Ava reached into her husband's pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and held it out with a benevolent smile. "And for you, Sophia dear," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "a little tip for your excellent service this weekend. You've played your part beautifully." A wave of shock, followed by snickers and pitying glances, washed over Sophia. Every eye was on her, waiting for the tears, the stammering denial, the inevitable collapse. This was the kill shot. Calvin felt a white-hot rage build in his chest. He started to rise, to tear the microphone from Ava's hand, to end this farce, but a light touch on his arm stopped him. It was Sophia. She gave him a look not of fear, but of profound, unsettling calm. She stood up, slowly, gracefully. She walked to the stage. She took the $100 bill from a stunned Ava's hand, folded it neatly, and then took the microphone. She smiled. A small, genuine smile that seemed to momentarily disarm everyone. "Thank you, Ava," she said, her voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the silent tent. "Thank you for your generosity. It reminds me so much of the way your family was so generous when they took everything from mine." A confused murmur rippled through the guests. Ava's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of uncertainty. Sophia's smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold, hard clarity. She looked directly at Ava, her eyes burning with a fire that had been banked for years. "My name," she said, her voice ringing with purpose, "is Sophia Baker, daughter of Edward Baker." She let the name hang in the air for a moment, a ghost at the feast. Perhaps you remember that name. Internal monologue, Calvin's POV. The world didn't just tilt, it shattered. The name, Baker, crashed into Calvin's consciousness like a freight train. Edward Baker. Baker Industries, the massive financial scandal from a decade ago. It was a legendary case, a story of corporate greed and a spectacular fall from grace. He remembered the headlines, the disgraced CEO, the ruined family. And in that instant, every piece of the puzzle that was Sophia clicked into place with sickening, brutal clarity. The quiet resilience, the sadness in her eyes that was too old for her years, her refusal to be intimidated by his wealth, her intimate knowledge of fear and strategy, her presence in that bakery. It wasn't a coincidence. It was an ambush. The entire carefully constructed reality of the past 48 hours collapsed around him. He wasn't the master of this game. He wasn't the one pulling the strings. He had been a pawn, a tool, a convenient, arrogant fool who had walked right into her trap, offering her the very key she needed to unlock the door to her revenge. The rage he had felt moments before evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollowing shock that stole the air from his lungs. He felt the 100 pairs of eyes in the room, but for the first time in his life, he didn't care what they thought of him. His own self-assessment was far more damning. He had been played. His ego, the bedrock of his entire existence, crumbled into dust. But then, something else, something far worse, rose from the wreckage. It was a thick, suffocating wave of guilt. He had taken this woman, a woman whose life had been destroyed by tragedy, and he had used her. He had paid her to be a prop in his petty, pathetic war with his ex. He had, with breathtaking ignorance, dragged her back to the very source of her pain and put her on display for his own selfish amusement. He hadn't just been a pawn in her game. He had been an unwitting instrument of cruelty in her life's tragedy. The realization was a physical blow, leaving him utterly, devastatingly broken. The truth is like a fire. It has been lit, but is the flame of justice strong enough to burn down an empire built on lies? Sophia has fired the first shot in the war for her father's honor. Will she win the final battle? If you believe it's time for justice to be served, comment with the keyword justice. The drive back to the city was a silent, suffocating ordeal. Calvin didn't remember the chaos after Sophia's announcement, the frantic whispers, the way Ava's face had crumpled from triumphant malice into pale, panicked denial. All he remembered was turning to the seat beside him and finding it empty. Sophia was gone. She hadn't waited for him. She hadn't demanded an explanation or offered one. She had simply vanished, leaving him alone in the ruins of the world he had just discovered. Now he stood in the center of his penthouse. The city lights, once a symbol of his kingdom, now felt like a million mocking eyes. The silence in the vast, minimalist space was no longer a sign of peace and control. It was a crushing, echoing void. He had won. He had utterly and completely humiliated Ava on her wedding day. His victory was absolute, and it meant nothing, less than nothing. He walked to the bar and poured a scotch, his hand moving on autopilot. He raised the glass to his lips, but the smell of it, usually a comfort, now turned his stomach. He slammed the tumbler down on the marble, the sound cracking through the silence. The amber liquid sloshed over the rim, a wasted offering to the ghosts that now filled the room. Sophia Baker, daughter of Edward Baker. The words replayed in his mind, a relentless, torturous loop. He sank onto the leather sofa, the same one where he had tossed his phone with such casual arrogance just days before. He felt a phantom weight in his pocket and pulled out the navy blue dress she had worn. He must have picked it up from their hotel suite without even realizing it. The silk was cool and smooth against his skin, and it carried her scent. Not a heavy perfume, but something subtle and clean, like rain and fresh air and a hint of the sugar that clung to her from the bakery. He buried his face in the fabric, and the full weight of his actions crashed down on him. The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing pressure in his chest that made it hard to breathe. It wasn't just the humiliation of being used. That was a simple, clean wound to his pride. This was something deeper, uglier. This was the sickening realization that he had been a villain in someone else's story without even knowing it. He thought of her in the bakery, her quiet dignity as she refused his money. He thought of her in the boutique, her sharp, intelligent eyes seeing right through his shallow plans. He thought of her on the terrace, her profound sadness and her shocking strength. He had seen all the pieces of who she was, but his arrogance had been a blinder, preventing him from seeing the truth they formed. He had looked at a woman forged in the fires of tragedy and seen only a tool for his own petty revenge. For the first time in his life, Calvin Moore understood the absolute impotence of his power. He could buy companies, crush competitors, bend markets to his will, but he couldn't undo a single moment of the pain he had caused her. He couldn't erase the memory of Ava holding out that $100 bill, a humiliation he had paid for, a stage he had set. His money, his influence, his entire world, it was all just a collection of useless, glittering trash in the face of this real, profound human suffering. And in that hollow, agonizing space, a new feeling began to take root, something terrifying and utterly foreign to him. It was the moment on the terrace, his thumb brushing away a tear from her cheek. It was the surge of protective fury he'd felt when Ava had attacked her. It was the quiet admiration that had been growing since she'd first challenged him. It all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth that struck him with the force of a physical blow. He was in love with her. It wasn't the possessive, ego-driven desire he'd mistaken for love with Ava. This was different. This was a raw, aching admiration for her spirit. It was a desperate, clawing need to somehow make things right, to stand between her and the world that had hurt her so badly. It was a realization that becoming a man worthy of her respect was now more important than any deal, any victory, any form of success he had ever known. He loved her, not because he wanted to own her, but because meeting her had shown him the utter bankruptcy of his own soul, and he was desperate to become a man she could one day forgive. Dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in bruised shades of purple and gray. The city was still asleep, but Calvin had not slept. The long, agonizing night had burned away the shock and self-pity, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. Guilt was a passive emotion. Remorse was useless without action. Love, he was beginning to understand, was a verb. He wasn't in his penthouse anymore. He was in his office, a different kind of sanctuary, one built for action, not introspection. He sat behind his enormous desk, the polished surface reflecting his tired, drawn face. He had showered and changed, but the tuxedo from the wedding lay in a heap in the corner, a discarded skin of the man he used to be. He picked up his phone. His movements were deliberate, precise. He didn't hesitate. He scrolled to a single contact, a name he kept for situations that required absolute discretion and ruthless efficiency. The phone was answered on the second ring. "Mr. Moore," a gravelly voice said. No pleasantries. This was a man who dealt in facts, not feelings. "Marcus," Calvin said, his own voice low and steady, devoid of the emotion that had torn him apart all night. "I have a job for you. It's a priority." "I'm listening." Calvin leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the emerging skyline. "I want you to reopen the Baker Industries case, the collapse from 10 years ago." There was a brief pause on the other end. "That's a cold case, Mr. Moore. Officially it's closed. Man named Edward Baker took the fall." "I know who took the fall," Calvin said, his voice tight. "I want to know who pushed him. I want every transaction, every phone log, every email connected to Ava Wilson and her father, Senator Wilson, for the 6 months leading up to the collapse and the 6 months after. I want to know who they talked to, where they transferred money, what they had for breakfast, everything, Marcus. Dig it all up." "That's a deep dig," the investigator said, a note of professional appreciation in his voice. "It'll be expensive." "There is no budget," Calvin stated flatly. The words, which he had used countless times to intimidate rivals and fuel acquisitions, now had a different weight. They were not a display of power, but a pledge. "I don't care what it costs or who you have to lean on. I want the truth." He was about to hang up, but he paused. He had to make one thing clear. This wasn't business. This wasn't about getting back at Ava for the humiliation she'd caused him. That petty war was over. A meaningless skirmish in the face of this new reality. "And Marcus," he added, his voice dropping, becoming more personal than he had ever been with this man. "This isn't about revenge. This is about justice." He ended the call and stood up, walking to the vast window that overlooked his city. The sun was beginning to climb, casting long shadows across the streets below. For the first time, he wasn't looking at it as a king surveying his domain. He was looking at it as a man with a mission. Apologies were just words. Flowers and gifts were insults. The only currency that mattered now was action. The only thing he could offer Sophia was the one thing that had been stolen from her, the truth. And he would use every ounce of his wealth and power not to manipulate the world, but to set it right. The days that followed blurred into a relentless montage of work and obsession. Calvin's office transformed into a war room, the minimalist decor buried under a chaotic avalanche of documents, timelines, and financial charts. He barely ate, slept even less, fueled by black coffee and a burning, righteous fury he had never known before. Marcus and his team of forensic accountants and investigators were ghosts, moving through the digital and physical world with silent efficiency. They were Calvin's army, and he was their general, directing the assault on the past. The first breakthrough came from a dusty archive in the basement of a law firm. A junior investigator, bleary-eyed from staring at spreadsheets for 36 hours straight, found it. A discrepancy. A single transfer of funds from a Wilson family holding company to an untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands, dated 2 days after Edward Baker was indicted. It was a thread. Calvin told them to pull it. The thread led them through a labyrinth of shell corporations and falsified invoices. It was a masterclass in deception, designed to hide a simple truth, a payoff. But to whom? The answer came from a late-night meeting in a dimly lit parking garage. Marcus had found him. Arthur Vance, the former chief financial officer of the Wilson Corporation. Vance was a ghost of a man, with haunted eyes and a tremor in his hands. He was living under a different name in a different state, a man who had spent a decade looking over his shoulder. Calvin met with him personally. The old Calvin would have used threats, leverage, intimidation. The new Calvin sat across from the terrified man in the back seat of a black sedan and did something different. He offered him protection. "I know what they did to you, Mr. Vance," Calvin said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual authority, and filled instead with a weary empathy. "I know they threatened you, threatened your family. I'm not them. I have resources they can only dream of. I can guarantee your safety, your family's safety. All I want is the truth." It was the promise of safety, not the threat of exposure, that finally broke the man's decade of silence. With tears in his eyes, Vance told them everything. He spoke of the falsified reports he was forced to sign, the internal audits he was ordered to bury. He was the key witness, but the final, damning piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. It was a forgotten personal effects box from a junior-level assistant who had worked for Ava during her time as an intern at Baker Industries. The assistant had been fired shortly after the scandal broke. Tucked away in the box was a small micro-cassette recorder, the kind used for taking notes. On it was a single, unlabeled tape. In the sterile quiet of a sound lab, they played it. First, there was only static. Then, a young woman's voice, arrogant and giddy with success, boasting to a friend over the phone. It was unmistakably Ava. He was so trusting. her recorded voice laughed, a cruel, chilling sound. Like a lamb to the slaughter. Daddy said all it would take is a little push, a few misplaced documents. Edward Baker was so busy trying to be a good man, he never saw the wolves at his door. By the time he realizes what happened, I'll be a hero, and the Baker name will be mud. Calvin listened, his eyes closed, his hands clenched into fists on the table. It was the smoking gun, the undeniable, venomous truth, captured on a flimsy piece of magnetic tape. He had it. He had the weapon to destroy Ava Wilson and clear Edward Baker's name. He had the key to justice for Sophia. He didn't call. He didn't send a text or an email drafted by a team of lawyers. He didn't send a car. He drove himself, his own hands on the wheel of a nondescript sedan taken from his private garage. He drove through the city, away from the glittering towers of wealth and power, and into the quiet, tree-lined streets of Sophia's neighborhood. He parked across the street from her apartment building, the same one he had researched before this all began. It looked different now, less like a target and more like a home. He could smell the sweet scent of baking from the corner slice down the block, a scent that now tied itself into a knot in his stomach. In his hand, he held a single, slim USB drive. It felt impossibly heavy. It contained everything. Scanned copies of the falsified documents, the offshore bank transfers, Arthur Vance's full sworn deposition, and the digital file of Ava's chilling confession. It was a decade of lies and pain, condensed into a few gigabytes of data. It was a bomb. He got out of the car and walked to her door. He didn't feel powerful. He felt like a penitent on a pilgrimage. He raised his hand to knock, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt a tremor of true, profound fear. Fear that she wouldn't open the door. Fear that she would. He knocked. The sound was soft, tentative. Seconds stretched into an eternity. He heard the slide of a bolt, and the door opened a few inches. Sophia stood there, framed in the warm light of her apartment. She wasn't wearing a baker's apron or an elegant dress. She was in simple jeans and a soft gray sweater, her hair pulled back from her face. She looked tired, but her eyes were clear and cold as ice. They held no warmth, no recognition of the connection they'd shared on the terrace. They looked at him as if he were a stranger, an unwelcome solicitor. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. The coldness was a physical blow, but he deserved it. He had rehearsed 100 speeches in his head, 100 ways to say he was sorry, to explain, to beg, but looking at her now, at the fortified wall she had built around herself, he knew that words were useless. They were his tools, the tools of a manipulator, and they had no place here. He said nothing. He simply held out his hand, offering her the USB drive. She stared at it, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. She didn't move to take it. "What is that?" His own voice was raw, hoarse, as if he hadn't used it in days. "This isn't an apology," he said, the words costing him more than any billion-dollar deal ever had. "Apologies are for me. This is for you." He pushed the drive a little closer. "This is your father's justice, the truth." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Confusion? Disbelief? A spark of the old fire? Her hand, hesitant at first, slowly reached out and took the small device from his palm. Her fingers were cool against his. The transaction was complete. He had delivered the message. He had done the one thing he could do. "The decision is yours," he said quietly. "What you do with it? It's all up to you." And then he did the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. He turned his back on her and walked away. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for a second chance. He didn't even ask her to call. He simply walked away, leaving her with the power, the truth, and the choice. It was the only way to prove that the man who had walked up to her door was not the same one who had hired her in the rain. For 2 days, Sophia did nothing. The small black USB drive set on her coffee table, a tiny object radiating immense, terrifying power. She would circle it like a wary animal, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Part of her, the part that had been nursing a decade-old wound, wanted to plug it in, to drink down the poison in the proof. Another part was terrified. The truth, after so long, felt like a cliff edge she wasn't sure she was ready to step off. On the 3rd day, she made coffee, sat down at her small kitchen table, and plugged the drive into her laptop. She spent hours reading, her face pale in the glow of the screen. She saw the intricate web of lies, the cold, calculated transactions. She read the tearful, detailed confession of Arthur Vance. And then she clicked on the audio file. She put on her headphones and pressed play. The static hissed, and then she heard it, Ava's voice, young, cruel, and utterly recognizable. Like a lamb to the slaughter, Edward Baker was so busy trying to be a good man. The Baker name will be mud. Sophia closed her eyes, and a single hot tear, a tear she had held back for 10 years, finally fell. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of vindication, of release. The weight that had been crushing her soul for a decade, finally, blessedly lifted. Her father wasn't a failure. He was a victim, and she had the proof. She could go to the police. She could leak it to the press. But she knew Ava. She knew the Wilson family. They would spin it, bury it, use their power and influence to discredit the evidence. A public accusation needed a public stage. It needed to be a perfectly executed strike, leaving no room for escape, and as much as she hated to admit it, there was only one person she knew who was a master of that kind of warfare. She picked up her phone. Her thumb hovered over Calvin's number. A number she had memorized from his business card and had never intended to use again. Her pride warred with her purpose. But this was bigger than her pride. This was for her father. She pressed the call button. They met at a quiet, anonymous coffee shop halfway between her world and his. It was a neutral ground of exposed brick and the smell of roasted coffee beans. When Calvin walked in, he looked different. The arrogant, razor-sharp edge was gone, replaced by a quiet, weary tension. He saw her at a small table in the back and walked over, his movements hesitant. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. The last time they had seen each other, he had been her arrogant employer, and she had shattered his world. It was Sophia who broke it. She pushed a notebook across the table. "I've listened to it," she said, her voice steady. "I've read everything." Calvin just nodded, his eyes searching hers for something, anger, recrimination, anything. He found only a calm, focused intensity. "Going to the authorities isn't enough," she continued, her voice low and strategic. "Her father is still a powerful man. They'll tie this up in court for years. The evidence will be challenged. Witnesses will be intimidated. We need to do this in a way that's public, undeniable, and final." Calvin listened, a slow burn of admiration starting to replace the guilt in his chest. She wasn't asking for his help to fight her battle. She was inviting him to be her ally in a war she was already planning to win. "What do you have in mind?" he asked, his voice quiet. This was no longer a confrontation. It was a strategy session. Sophia leaned forward, her eyes alight with a fierce intelligence. "Ava's greatest strength is her public image, her charity work, her social standing. That's also her greatest weakness. She's launching a new philanthropic foundation next month. A big gala. The press will be there. Everyone will be there." Calvin saw it instantly. The plan began to form between them, an unspoken architecture of revenge and justice. "She'll want a big, respectable name to give the keynote donation," he said, the pieces clicking into place. "Someone to legitimize the whole affair." "Someone like you," Sophia finished, a glint in her eye. He looked at her, truly looked at the woman across the table. She was no longer just the daughter of Edward Baker, a victim of a terrible injustice. She was a brilliant strategist, a warrior. And in that quiet coffee shop, over the steam of 2 cooling cups of coffee, their roles were redefined. He was not her savior, and she was not his pawn. He had the resources, the access, the inside knowledge of their world. She had the righteous cause, the intimate understanding of her enemy, and the iron will to see it through. They were partners, an unlikely, formidable alliance. A power couple, forged not by romance but by a shared purpose. "Tell me everything you know about that gala," Calvin said, pulling the notebook toward him. The war had begun. In the weeks leading up to the gala, Ava Hayes, née Wilson, was living in a state of blissful ignorance. The unpleasantness at her wedding had been a momentary embarrassment, a bizarre outburst from a nobody that had been quickly forgotten. In her mind, she had won. She had her perfect husband, her secure social standing, and now, her crowning achievement, the Wilson Foundation for Children's Literacy. It was the final, glittering piece of her public persona, cementing her image as a benevolent philanthropist. She was in her new, exquisitely decorated office, reviewing the seating chart for the gala when her assistant buzzed in. "Ma'am, Calvin Moore's office is on the line. They're calling to RSVP." Ava's perfectly glossed lips curved into a triumphant smile. Of course he's coming, she thought. He can't stay away. The fact that he was attending her event felt like the ultimate validation of final surrender. "Put him through," she said, her voice smooth as cream. It wasn't Calvin on the line, but his executive assistant, a woman with a voice so crisp and professional it could cut glass. The message was simple. Mr. Moore would be delighted to attend the gala. Furthermore, in recognition of their long-standing family friendship, he wished to make a substantial 7-figure donation to the foundation, which he would be honored to announce during the evening speeches. Ava nearly dropped the phone. A 7-figure donation, announced live on stage by Calvin Moore himself? It was more than she could have dreamed. It was the ultimate seal of approval. It would make her foundation the talk of the town for months. Her last lingering fear that Calvin might still harbor some resentment evaporated. He was crawling back, his checkbook leading the way. "That is wonderful news," Ava managed to say, her voice trembling with excitement. "Please, tell Calvin we would be absolutely honored." Meanwhile, in a secure, soundproofed conference room in Calvin's building, the real work was being done. Calvin and Sophia sat across a long table from a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Her name was Sarah Jenkins, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist, known for toppling corrupt politicians and exposing corporate fraud. She was the best, and she was notoriously immune to pressure and bribes. On the table between them was a copy of the USB drive. Sarah had already reviewed its contents. "This is dynamite," she said, her voice a low, appreciative hum. She looked from Calvin to Sophia. "The audio recording is the kill shot, but Vance's testimony gives it the legal backbone. This isn't just a scandal. It's a criminal conspiracy." "We know," Sophia said, her voice steady. "But if we release it now, they'll have time to prepare, to create a counter-narrative. We need it to land with maximum impact." "At the gala," Sarah finished, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. She understood the strategy perfectly. "You want to strip mine her reputation in real time, in front of her most ardent supporters." "Exactly," Calvin said. "I'll be on stage, preparing to announce my donation. That's the moment. My team will feed the audio to the room's sound system. At the exact same instant, your publication will post the full story, complete with the documents and Vance's testimony." Sarah nodded, her eyes gleaming. "A coordinated, multi-platform takedown. I like it. My editors will love it." She looked at Sophia with a newfound respect. "It's a hell of a risk. You're putting a lot of faith in him." She gestured toward Calvin. Sophia met Calvin's gaze across the table. A month ago, she would have laughed at the idea. but she had seen the man he was now, the relentless, obsessive man who had channeled all his formidable power, not for his own gain, but for her father's justice. She saw the guilt that still haunted his eyes, and the unwavering determination that had replaced it. "I am," Sophia said, her voice clear and confident. "We are." The trap was set. The bait had been taken. All that was left was for the guest of honor to walk onto the stage and spring it. The ballroom was a symphony of excess. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars dripped from the ceiling, casting a warm, golden light over the 300 guests. The air was thick with the scent of expensive flowers and the murmur of powerful people congratulating each other on their own generosity. At the center of it all, on a raised dais, was Ava. She was a vision in a gown of silver silk, playing the part of the gracious hostess to perfection, her smile never faltering. Sophia stood in the shadows at the back of the room, near the sound technician Calvin's team had quietly replaced. She wore a simple black dress, an anonymous ghost at the feast. Her heart was a steady, rhythmic drum. This wasn't about nerves. This was the calm of a soldier before the final battle. Calvin was at their table near the front, a picture of calm, devastating elegance. When the MC called his name, a wave of enthusiastic applause filled the room. Ava beamed, her face a mask of pure triumph, as she watched him ascend the stage. This was her moment. Calvin stepped up to the podium, the lights glinting off his cufflinks. He looked out at the sea of expectant faces, his gaze finally landing on Ava. He gave her a small, unreadable smile. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm and resonant, filling the vast ballroom. "We're here tonight to celebrate a wonderful new beginning, the Wilson Foundation, a testament to the power of giving back." He paused, letting the room hang on his every word. "Ava has asked me to make a special contribution to launch this noble cause, and I am happy to oblige." Ava practically glowed. Her victory was complete. "My donation tonight," Calvin continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming harder, colder, "is the truth." A flicker of confusion crossed Ava's face. Before she could process his words, it began. A faint hiss from the speakers, then static, and then a voice, young, arrogant, and chillingly familiar, filled the ballroom. He was so trusting, like a lamb to the slaughter. The room fell silent. A wave of confusion rippled through the guests. Whose voice was that? Ava's smile froze on her face, her eyes wide with dawning horror. "Daddy said all it would take is a little push, a few misplaced documents. Edward Baker was so busy trying to be a good man, he never saw the wolves at his door." At that exact moment, the two enormous screens flanking the stage, which had been displaying the Foundation's logo, flickered to life. They didn't show smiling children. They showed scanned bank statements, offshore account numbers, forged signatures next to Edward Baker's real one, a signed, sworn affidavit from Arthur Vance. Simultaneously, a wave of light swept through the darkened ballroom as 300 smartphones buzzed and lit up in unison. On every screen was the same headline from Sarah Jenkins's publication, an alert pushed to every major news outlet in the country. The Wilson deception, how Senator's daughter framed Edward Baker, new evidence reveals. The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute, a deafening void where a moment before there had been applause. Every eye in the room was now on Ava, her face a ghastly shade of white under the stage lights. Her carefully constructed world had just been annihilated in the space of 30 seconds. "Lies!" she shrieked, her voice a raw, ugly sound that bore no resemblance to her usual honeyed tones. "It's all lies! He's a liar!" She pointed a trembling finger at Calvin, her composure shattering like glass. But then her wild, panicked gaze swept the room and landed on the figure in black, standing in the shadows. Sophia. In that instant, Ava understood. This wasn't Calvin's revenge. This was something older, deeper. This was justice. The realization broke the last of her restraint. The mask of the philanthropist, the society queen, the benevolent hostess, disintegrated completely, revealing the snarling, cornered animal beneath. "You!" she screamed, her face contorted with pure, undiluted hatred. "You did this! You little nobody!" With a guttural cry of rage, Ava launched herself off the stage, her silver gown tearing as she stumbled, and lunged toward Sophia, her hands clawed, ready to attack. She never made it. The ballroom doors burst open, and 2 uniformed police officers, followed by a detective in a trench coat, strode into the room. The flashing red and blue lights from their vehicles outside pulsed through the grand windows, painting the horrified faces of the guests in garish, strobing colors. They intercepted Ava just as she reached the edge of the crowd. "Ava Hayes," the detective said, his voice calm but firm, easily cutting through her hysterical denials. "You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and perjury." The click of the handcuffs was a sharp metallic sound that echoed through the silent, cavernous ballroom. As they led her away, a stunned, broken woman, the blinding flashes of 100 cameras began to go off, capturing the final, ignominious collapse of the House of Wilson. Justice had been served. Publicly, irrevocably, and with a satisfaction that was absolute. Hours later, the chaos had subsided. The flashing lights, the shouting reporters, the shocked and scattered guests, all of it had faded, leaving behind a city settling into its nightly rhythm. They had left the gala separately, melting away into the night without a word, but they both knew where they would end up. Calvin found her on the same rooftop terrace, at the same resort, a place that now felt like it belonged only to them. He had returned there, driven by an instinct he didn't fully understand. The moon was high and bright, casting a silver sheen on the dark, placid ocean. The air was cool, carrying the clean, salty scent of the sea. She was standing at the balustrade, just as she had been that first night, but everything was different. The tension was gone from her shoulders, the weary, guarded look in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, quiet peace. She looked up as he approached, and for the first time since the wedding, she offered him a small, genuine smile. He stopped a few feet away from her, his hands in his pockets, feeling more exposed and vulnerable than he had on that stage in front of hundreds. The war was over. The victory was won. And now, there was nothing left but the quiet, terrifying space between them. "It's over," she said, her voice soft, carried on the breeze. "It's finally over." "Yes," he said, his own voice quiet. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching the moonlight dance on the water. It wasn't the charged, uncertain silence of their first meeting here. It was a shared silence of resolution, of a journey completed. Finally, Calvin turned to face her. He had to say it. He had to give voice to the truth that had reshaped his entire world. "I was wrong, Sophia," he began, his voice raw with a humility he had never known. "About everything. I was arrogant and selfish, and I saw the whole world as a game to be won." He took a hesitant step closer. "But meeting you, seeing your strength, your integrity, it showed me what a hollow, empty thing my life really was. It showed me that I could be a better man." He looked into her eyes, letting her see the truth, the fear, and the hope that was laid bare in his own. "I love you, Sophia," he said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "Not because I want to possess you, or because you complete some part of me. I love you because I admire you. I admire the person you are, more than anyone I have ever known." Sophia listened, her expression soft in the moonlight. The anger she had held for him, the resentment for the part he had played, had long since been replaced by something else. She had watched him dismantle his own ego piece by piece. She had seen him wield his immense power not for profit or pride, but for justice, for her. She had seen the real man, the one who had been buried under a mountain of wealth and arrogance. "I know," she said, her voice warm and full of an emotion he hadn't dared to hope for. "I see you, Calvin, the real you." He took another step, closing the space between them. He slowly raised a hand, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw, just as he had once wiped away a tear in this very spot. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment. When she opened them again, they were shining with unshed tears. But these were not tears of sorrow. He lowered his head, and she met him halfway. Their lips met in a kiss that was nothing like the fiery, possessive kisses of his past. There was no conquest, no passion born of conflict. It was a kiss of profound understanding, of mutual respect. It was quiet and gentle, and filled with the promise of a new beginning. It was the kiss of two equals, two partners, who had found in each other not a prize to be won, but a home to be built. 1 year later. The autumn sun cast a warm, golden glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the corner office. It was a different office from Calvin's stark, minimalist fortress in the sky. This one was filled with light, warm woods, and thriving green plants. On the wall behind the large desk hung a single framed photograph, a black and white portrait of Edward Baker, his kind eyes smiling down on the room. Sophia stood looking out the window, not at a distant, abstract cityscape, but at the bustling streets below. She was the CEO of the newly re-established Baker Industries, a company she had painstakingly rebuilt from the ashes of her family's name. It wasn't the corporate behemoth it had once been, but it was something better. It was a company built on integrity, known for its ethical practices and its fair treatment of employees. She had become a different kind of titan, one respected not for her ruthlessness, but for her resilience and her principles. The door opened and Calvin walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He no longer moved with the aggressive, predatory confidence of a man who owned every room he entered. There was a new ease to his posture, a quiet contentment that had replaced the restless energy. He had found that the relentless pursuit of the next deal was a hollow victory compared to the quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful. He handed her a cup, his fingers brushing against hers. "The board approved the expansion project," he said, his voice a low, happy rumble. "I know," she said, a playful smile on her lips. "I was in the meeting, remember?" He grinned, leaning against the window frame beside her. "Right. I keep forgetting I'm not the only CEO in the room anymore." He wasn't her protector or her savior. He was her partner in every sense of the word. He advised, he supported, he challenged, but he never overshadowed. He had found a purpose not in leading, but in walking alongside her. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their coffee, 2 powerful figures looking out at the city. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "The chaos? The fight?" He considered the question, his gaze following hers to the street below. "I thought I would," he admitted, "but I've found that building something is a lot more satisfying than breaking things." He turned to look at her, his eyes full of a deep, unwavering love. "And what we're building, it's worth more than all of it." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand finding his. They weren't on a moonlit terrace anymore, caught in a moment of unexpected connection. They were here, in the bright light of day, their foundations solid, their future stretching out before them. Later that afternoon, They walked hand in hand through a small city park, the autumn leaves crunching under their feet. The air was crisp and clean. A few blocks away, the corner slice was still there, now with a new owner, a young baker Sophia had personally mentored. They passed by, and the familiar scent of cinnamon and yeast drifted on the breeze, a sweet reminder of where it all began. He squeezed her hand, and she smiled up at him, her face full of a light and happiness that was deep and real. It was a happiness that had been earned, forged in the fires of injustice, and rebuilt with courage and integrity. It was a quiet, steady love, a partnership of equals, a life that was, at long last, truly their own. And so, the next chapter of Sophia and Calvin's life begins. Thank you for joining them on this turbulent yet rewarding journey. Which moment in the story touched your heart the most? Share your feelings in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the stories to come.